Chapter 17. The Scramble for Africa, Late 19th Century, the Machine Gun and Empire. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century marked one of the most aggressive and transformative periods of European colonial expansion. In just a few decades, European powers partitioned and colonized nearly the entire African continent, subjugating its peoples, exploiting its resources, and redrawing its political boundaries. Central to this rapid and brutal conquest was the European advantage in military technology, particularly the Maxim gun. The first true machine gun, this new weapon of war gave European armies the ability to defeat large indigenous forces with devastating efficiency, enabling them to conquer vast territories with minimal losses. So the idea was pursued. The Maxim gun, along with other advanced military technologies, played a pivotal role in enabling European imperialism in Africa. European nations, driven by economic, political, and strategic interests, competed fiercely to claim African land and resources, with little regard for the consequences for the continent's people. The combination of technological superiority and European ambition allowed for the near-total colonization of Africa by the dawn of the 20th century, reshaping the continent's political, social, and economic landscape in ways that would have lasting repercussions. This chapter will explore how the Maxim gun became a symbol of European domination in Africa, examining its role in key conflicts such as the Battle of Omdurman and the broader process of colonial expansion. The chapter will also address the impact of technological disparity on African societies and the ways in which European powers used superior weaponry not only to conquer, but also to control and exploit African populations. The Maxim gun, a game-changer in colonial warfare. Invented in 1884 by Hiram Maxim, an American-British inventor, the Maxim gun was the world's first fully automatic machine gun. Unlike earlier firearms, which required manual reloading after each shot or burst, the Maxim gun could fire continuously by harnessing the energy of the gun's recoil to eject the spent cartridge and load the next one. This made it far more efficient and deadly than any previous weapon, capable of firing up to 600 rounds per minute, a rate of fire that could overwhelm and decimate large numbers of troops in a matter of seconds. The Maxim gun was embraced enthusiastically by European militaries, particularly those involved in colonial expansion. For the British, French, Germans, and Belgians, the Maxim gun became a symbol of their technological superiority over African forces, who were often armed with traditional weapons such as spears, bows, and shields, or outdated muskets. The gun's ability to mow down large formations of warriors from a distance made it an invaluable tool for conquering and controlling vast territories with relatively small European forces. The Maxim gun epitomized the broader technological advantage that European powers enjoyed during the scramble for Africa. By the late 19th century, Europe had experienced the Industrial Revolution, which had transformed its military capabilities. European armies were equipped with breech-loaded rifles, artillery, steam-powered ships, and the telegraph, all of which contributed to their ability to project power across great distances. This technological disparity made it nearly impossible for African societies, many of which had not undergone similar technological advancements, to resist European imperialism effectively. The Berlin Conference and the division of Africa. The scramble for Africa formally began with the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, where European powers, led by Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, met to establish the rules for the partitioning of Africa. The goal was to prevent conflict between European nations over territorial claims, and the result was a map of Africa divided into spheres of influence, with little consideration for the existing ethnic, cultural, or political boundaries of the continent's peoples. The conference did not involve any African representatives, and the decisions made by the European powers were based solely on their own interests. Nations like Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy carved out territories for themselves, laying the groundwork for decades of colonial rule. This arbitrary division of the continent would have long-lasting consequences, as it often grouped together disparate ethnic groups within the same colonial borders, leading to tensions that would persist well into the post-colonial era. With their territorial claims formalized, European nations embarked on a campaign of rapid expansion, using their superior military technology to conquer African societies and impose colonial rule. The Maxim gun, in particular, became a key instrument of conquest, as it allowed relatively small European forces to defeat much larger African armies with devastating ease. The Battle of Omdurman, the power of the Maxim gun. One of the most famous and telling examples of the Maxim gun's impact on colonial warfare occurred at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, during the British campaign to reconquer Sudan. Led by Lord Kitchener, the British Army sought to defeat the Mahdist forces, who had established an independent state in Sudan after expelling the Egyptians in the 1880s. The Mahdist army, composed largely of Sudanese warriors, relied on traditional weapons, such as spears and swords, as well as a few outdated firearms. On September 2, 1898, the British forces, equipped with Maxim guns, artillery and modern rifles, faced off against a Mahdist army of over 500 men. The British, numbering around 2,5,0,0, were vastly outnumbered, but their technological superiority was overwhelming. As the Mahdist warriors charged across the open desert toward the British lines, they were met with a withering barrage of fire from the Mahdist line's Cartridge line. The results were devastating. The British guns cut down wave after wave of Mahdist fighters, killing thousands before they could even get close to the British lines. By the end of the battle, over 1,000 Mahdist soldiers lay dead, with another 300 wounded. In contrast, the British lost fewer than 50 men. The Battle of Omdurman demonstrated in the most brutal terms the power of modern weaponry to annihilate traditional armies. The victory allowed the British to reassert control over Sudan and marked the beginning of a new phase of imperial expansion in Africa. The battle also highlighted the enormous asymmetry in warfare between European powers and African states. The Mahdist fighters were incredibly brave and determined, but their traditional tactics were no match for the Maxim gun's firepower. The ease with which the British won the battle underscored the futility of resisting European armies without comparable technology, a lesson that would be repeated in other parts of Africa throughout the Scramble for Africa, European conquest, and African resistance. While the Maxim gun played a decisive role in many colonial victories, African societies did not simply capitulate to European domination. Across the continent, African leaders and warriors mounted fierce resistance to European encroachment, often employing innovative tactics and leveraging their deep knowledge of the local terrain. However, the technological disparity between African forces and European armies made it difficult for even the most determined resistance movements to succeed in the long term. In West Africa, the powerful Ashanti Empire resisted British attempts to subjugate their kingdom for much of the 19th century. The Ashanti, armed with muskets and traditional weapons, fought a series of wars against the British, known as the Anglo-Ashanti Wars. Despite initial successes, the Ashanti were ultimately defeated in 1900, largely due to the British use of Maxim guns and modern artillery. In East Africa, the Maji-Maji Rebellion 1907 in German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, saw indigenous communities rise up against German colonial rule. The rebels, believing in the protective powers of spiritual weapons, despite their courage, the rebellion was brutally suppressed by German forces armed with Maxim guns, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 25,000 Africans, many from starvation and disease following the conflict. One of the most notable exceptions to the pattern of European military dominance was the Ethiopian victory at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Led by Emperor Menelik Teked, the Ethiopians successfully resisted an Italian invasion, in part because they had acquired modern rifles and artillery from European powers like Russia and France. The Ethiopians' ability to match Italian firepower allowed them to inflict a humiliating defeat on the Italians, securing Ethiopia's independence and making it one of the few African nations to successfully resist European colonization during the Scramble for Africa. The impact of technological disparity on African societies. The rapid European conquest of Africa during the late 19th century was made possible not only by the Maxim gun, but also by other technological advancements, including steamships, railways, and telegraphs. These innovations allowed European powers to project their military and political power across vast distances, rapidly reinforcing their colonial forces and suppressing resistance. The ability to move troops and supplies quickly, combined with superior communication through the telegraph, gave European colonial administrations a significant advantage over African societies, which were often decentralized and relied on traditional forms of communication and transportation. The consequences of this technological disparity for African societies were profound. European conquest and colonization led to the disruption of traditional political systems, the imposition of new economic structures designed to extract resources for European markets, and the exploitation of African labor. The introduction of cash crop agriculture, such as cotton, rubber, and coffee, displaced subsistence farming and made African economies dependent on global markets controlled by European powers. Colonial rule also brought about the brutal exploitation of African populations, particularly in regions controlled by Belgium and Germany. In the Congo Free State, ruled as the personal fiefdom of King Leopold II of Belgium, millions of Africans were forced into labor to extract rubber and other resources. The use of violence, including mutilation and murder, to enforce quotas led to the deaths of an estimated 10 million people in what is now known as one of the worst atrocities of the colonial period. In addition to economic exploitation, the European colonizers sought to impose their cultural and social systems on African populations. Missionary activities, combined with the introduction of European legal systems, education, and religion, aimed to civilize African societies in line with European norms. This cultural imperialism further undermined traditional African institutions and identities, contributing to the long-term erosion of indigenous cultures and identities. The long-term legacy of the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa had a profound and lasting impact on the continent. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers at the Berlin Conference, which ignored the ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diversity of Africa, laid the groundwork for future conflicts. Many of the civil wars and political tensions that have plagued Africa in the post-colonial era can be traced back to the divisions created by colonial borders, which grouped together or separated peoples with little regard for their historical relationships. The technological superiority that enabled European conquest also contributed to a legacy of underdevelopment in many parts of Africa. While the European powers built railways, roads, and other infrastructure, these developments were designed primarily to facilitate the extraction of resources rather than to promote local economic growth. The economic exploitation of Africa during the colonial period left many countries with economies that were heavily dependent on the export of raw materials, a pattern that continues to this day. Furthermore, the violence and coercion used to establish and maintain colonial rule, exemplified by the widespread use of the Maxim gun, created deep scars in African societies. The suppression of resistance movements and the brutal treatment of African populations by colonial authorities instilled a sense of trauma and resentment that fueled nationalist movements in the mid-20th century. The legacy of colonialism is still felt across Africa today, as many nations continue to grapple with the political, economic, and social challenges left behind by European imperialism. Conclusion. The Scramble for Africa was one of the most dramatic and destructive episodes of European colonial expansion, made possible by a profound technological imbalance between the colonizers and the colonized. The Maxim gun, as a symbol of European military superiority, played a central role in the conquest and domination of Africa, allowing small European armies to defeat much larger indigenous forces with devastating ease. The rapid colonization of Africa by European powers had far-reaching consequences for the continent's political, economic, and social development. The technological superiority of European armies enabled the extraction of vast resources, the imposition of colonial rule, and the suppression of African resistance. However, the cost of this conquest was immense, as African societies were profoundly disrupted, traditional political systems dismantled, and millions of lives lost to violence, exploitation, and disease. As we reflect on the role of technology in shaping global power dynamics, the story of the Scramble